In 1945, Japan was a pile of rubble, 2 atomic bombs, 67 other cities firebombed, the economy destroyed, the military disbanded, the emperor forced on radio to admit for the first time in history that he was not a god. The country had nothing, almost literally nothing. No oil, no iron ore worth speaking of, no coal to power an industrial revolution, no vast farmland, no rivers of gold. An island nation with mountains covering 73% of its land, leaving almost no room for agriculture. Today, Japan is the 4th largest economy on Earth. It has more Michelin-starred restaurants than France. Its companies, Toyota, Sony, Nintendo, Panasonic, are household names in countries that can't even find Japan on a map. It built the bullet train. It pioneered robotics. It has a life expectancy among the highest on the planet. So how does a country with almost no natural resources become one of the richest societies in human history? That's not a rhetorical question. There's an actual answer, and it's weirder and more deliberate than you think. First, let's be precise about just how resource-poor Japan actually is. Japan imports about 90% of its energy. It has virtually no domestic oil production. It imports nearly all of its iron, copper, and aluminum. It imports a significant portion of its food. Its forests are largely protected or inaccessible. And yet, it manufactures some of the most complex machines ever built by human hands. Compare that to somewhere like Saudi Arabia, which sat on the largest oil reserves in the world and still had to completely reinvent its economy twice. Or the Democratic Republic of Congo, home to enormous deposits of cobalt, gold, and coltan, which remains one of the poorest countries on Earth. There's actually a term for this: the resource curse. The idea that natural resource abundance tends to corrupt institutions, stifle innovation, and create an economy that just waits to be extracted rather than builds anything. Japan had the opposite problem and the opposite outcome. But here's the thing about Japan's rise that most people get wrong. It wasn't magic. It wasn't culture. It wasn't some mysterious work ethic that Westerners couldn't replicate. It was a strategy, a very specific, very deliberate industrial strategy, designed by bureaucrats, funded by American Cold War money, and executed with a level of national coordination that would make most governments today deeply uncomfortable. Here's how it worked. After World War II, the United States needed Japan as a buffer against Soviet expansion in Asia. That meant keeping Japan stable, and stable meant economically viable. So the Americans did something remarkable. They allowed Japan to rebuild its industry with almost no restrictions, behind a protective wall of trade barriers that would never have been tolerated anywhere else. Japan's government created a ministry called MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. It's since been restructured, but for decades, MITI was arguably the most powerful non-military institution in the world. MITI didn't just regulate industry. It directed it. It decided which sectors Japan would compete in. It identified technologies that would matter in 10, 20, 30 years. It steered credit toward those industries. It protected domestic companies from foreign competition long enough for them to get good. And then, crucially, it exposed them to global competition. That sequencing matters. Protect first, develop, then compete globally. Most countries try to skip the middle step. The industries MITI targeted read like a syllabus for the 20th century. Steel, shipbuilding, automobiles, electronics, semiconductors. MITI didn't pick these by accident.
It looked at where global demand was heading and bet national resources on getting there first. By the 1960s, Japan was the world's largest shipbuilder. By the 1970s, its steel was undercutting American producers. By the 1980s, Japanese car makers were outselling Detroit on Detroit's home turf. And American economists were, genuinely, in published papers, unable to explain how. There was something else, though, something that doesn't get mentioned in the standard story. Japan had a savings rate that was, for most of the post-war period, extraordinary. At its peak, Japanese households were saving around 20% of their income. Some years more. Compare that to the United States, where the savings rate hovered around 5 to 8%, and has since fallen well below that. Why does that matter? Because savings become capital, and capital becomes investment. Japanese banks had enormous pools of domestic money to lend, cheaply, to Japanese companies. Those companies could invest in technology, automation, and quality improvements that their American and European competitors simply couldn't afford. A Toyota factory didn't just build cars. It refined the process of building cars down to something almost mathematical, what they called the Toyota production system, which the rest of the world would eventually copy and rename lean manufacturing. Every car built in Japan was, in a sense, a manufactured export. Japan was importing raw steel, rubber, and glass, and exporting precision, reliability, and engineering. That's the trick. Japan figured out that the highest value export in the modern world isn't a commodity, it's a process. It's the knowledge of how to turn cheap inputs into expensive outputs. By the late 1980s, Japan wasn't just rich, it was intoxicated. Japanese companies were buying American landmarks, Rockefeller Center, Pebble Beach Golf Course, Columbia Pictures. The land under Tokyo's Imperial Palace was estimated at peak to be worth more than the entire state of California. American economists were writing serious books with titles like Japan as Number One. Management consultants were flying to Tokyo to study the Japanese way. The question in boardrooms from London to New York wasn't if Japan would overtake the United States, it was when. Then came 1990, the asset bubble that had inflated through the 1980s, fueled by cheap credit, speculative real estate, and a stock market that had tripled in 5 years, collapsed. The Nikkei stock index lost nearly half its value in a year. Real estate prices fell for the next 15 years. Banks were left holding trillions of yen in bad loans they could not acknowledge without triggering systemic collapse. So they didn't acknowledge them. They called them zombie loans. Companies that should have failed were kept alive by banks that couldn't afford to let them die. The keiretsu system, which had been Japan's great strength, became its great liability. Stability had curdled into paralysis. Japan entered what economists would diplomatically call the lost decade. Except it turned into 2, then arguably 3. The same institutions that built the miracle made the miracle impossible to reform. This is the part of the Japan story that tends to get airbrushed in the secrets of success narrative. The strategy that created extraordinary growth also created extraordinary rigidity. The very things that made Japan work, long-term relationships, stable employment, cross-shareholding, government direction, made it very, very hard to change course, and the world was changing. Here's the thing, though. After 30 years of stagnation, Japan is still one of the richest countries on Earth. Its GDP per capita, adjusted for purchasing power, remains among the highest in Asia and higher than most of Europe. Its infrastructure is world-class. Its public spaces are safe, clean, and functional in ways that would seem utopian to someone arriving from almost any other major city. Its inequality, measured by the Gini coefficient, is notably lower than the United States and approaching Scandinavian levels. The lost decades look different depending on what you measure. GDP growth? Anemic. Social stability? Remarkable. The average Japanese person did not experience 30 years of misery. They experienced 30 years of flatness, which, given where they'd come from and given what they'd built, might actually have been sustainable all along. Japan's story has been studied and imitated with varying success by South Korea, Taiwan, China, and Singapore. The broad model is sometimes called the developmental state, a government that treats industrial policy not as interference, but as strategy, that picks winners, not always correctly, but systematically and with a long time horizon. China's rise over the last 40 years is, in many ways, Japan's rise at 10 times the scale. State-directed investment, protected domestic industries, forced technology transfer, massive national savings rates, export-led manufacturing targeted at moving up the value chain. The West has, for the most part, watched this model work repeatedly and continued to insist it shouldn't. The ideological commitment to free markets is real, but so is the track record of the countries that ignored that commitment when they needed to build something. Japan taught the world that natural resources are not destiny. What you have in the ground is less important than what you do with what you have. That a country can import raw materials and export complexity. That the real asset, maybe the only asset that compounds without limit, is institutional knowledge, the accumulated learning of how to make things well. Japan didn't get rich by accident. It got rich by decision. Decisions made in rubble in 1945. Decisions made in government ministries through the 1950s and 60s. Decisions made by workers who showed up and improved the same process fractionally every single day for decades. Decisions made by companies that chose to compete on quality instead of waiting for the price of something underground to go up. And yes, decisions that also created vulnerabilities, that built rigidity into the system, that made Japan at its peak both more impressive and more fragile than it appeared. The model worked. Then it got stuck, and Japan is still, slowly, painfully, trying to figure out how to modernize an economic culture it built so well that it couldn't easily be rebuilt. That tension is worth sitting with, because the uncomfortable question at the center of Japan's story isn't how did they get rich? The uncomfortable question is, what do you do when the thing that made you exceptional becomes the thing that holds you back? Every country, every institution, every company eventually faces that question. Japan just faced it first.